Today's prayer comes from chapter 28 of Job, which is where the title of our whole course comes from. O God, where then does wisdom come from, and where is the place of understanding? Abaddon and Death say, we have heard a rumour of it with our ears. For you look to the ends of the earth and see everything under the heavens. When you made a decree for the rain and a way for the thunderbolt, and you said to humankind. So last week we left Job engaged in the task of theodicy, which is the theological turning my iPad. The theological examination of why a just and all-powerful God could allow suffering and evil to exist in the world. Job had become convinced that God was not particularly reasonable and that God was actually personally responsible for the suffering of the world. And so he gives this blast about God in chapter 9. I say that he, God, destroys both the blameless and the wicked. When disaster brings sudden death, he mocks at the calamity of the innocent. The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covers the eyes of its judges. If it is not he, who then is it? So we're picking up in today's study from chapters 8 and 9, where Bildad the Shuhite delivers a speech that is aimed at convincing Job that he must be being punished because he has a secret sin. And then Job's reply, which is to say, no, I have not done anything wrong. It's God that is to blame, not me. So he envisages that an all-powerful God must be responsible for the calamities that fall on human beings all across the world. Whatever is good and whatever is bad is all down to God. So Elizabeth has referred to this last week, and also in last Sunday's sermon, I think, the words of David Hume. Although this book says it's published in 1948, David Hume was, I think, was a 19th century philosopher. Hume, if we think about what Hume says, Job seems to have accepted that God must be somehow a malevolent being. He's able to prevent the bad things that happen, but he's actually not willing to prevent evil. Job does not understand why suffering should exist if God is able and willing to prevent it. So he's figuring God must be able but not willing. So David Hume said, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able to prevent evil but not willing? Then he is malevolent. That seems to be Job's accusation. Is he both willing and able? If that's the case, why then do we have evil? So we're going to plunge you right into discussion groups. First up, what do you think of Job's summation of what is going on in chapter 9? And think about those questions of David Hume, which you have in the material that's been sent out. How do you react to the way David Hume puts it? And does that help to explain the way that Job sees God?
Okay, how did you go in your discussion about what is Job's summation of what is going on and what do you think of it and how do you react to the questions of David Hume?
I think we're still as perplexed as Job.
Fair comment, Bill.
Many questions anyway.
We talked in our group that when someone is struggling, the words you say to them at the beginning become the end prediction. So if you're saying you need more faith to get through this, then when you end up being sicker than you started, then therefore it equals you don't have enough faith. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Did I explain that properly, my group?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We chatted about that, and then Ian chatted about random happenstance.
Yeah.
Ian, go for it.
Well, I gave the example of that lunatic psychopath who 5 or 6 years ago drove his car up the pavement in crowded Burke Street in Melbourne, mowing down and killing 5 people, including an 18-month-old baby in a pram. The people who were in Burke Street that morning had no idea that was going to happen. They couldn't control it. It was random happenstance. No amount of faith can explain that situation to you. You're in the situation of saying, look, this happened. Why did it happen? We don't know. That's the way of human life. These things happen, which actually persuades me that David Hume might be right.
Well, certainly his questions are provocative and you can see where they've come from. And I think, Ian, you've actually summed up the essence of the book of Job in some ways, as you're going to discover next week. So random happenstance is pretty important. I mean, Job doesn't know that yet.
But if I could just go on, I made the point that despite random happenstance, we hang on to our faith. We're a bit like Job in that respect, because if we didn't have our faith, we wouldn't be very much at all. It's faith that, to me, that makes us human.
Okay, thanks for that, Ian. Anyone else want to share anything? Margaret?
Oh, well, I was just going to add to what Ian was saying. We hang on to our faith, but it is when the bad things happen that we begin to ask the Job type questions. And that's when we struggle. And as we were saying in our group, nearly all the questions that we want to ask begin if God was, then how come, or so on. And these are the ones that we wrestle with so much, especially when something happens like Ian is talking about.
Yes.
Well, especially if we think that logic is going to persuade us. And like from probably Job to Plato to Descartes to David Hume, have all tried to look at this as a question of logic, that if God is this, then the other follows. Whereas when we come to, if you approach it from a point of faith, then do we suspend logic or do we seek our answers elsewhere?
Well, we become faith-seeking understanding, to use that good uniting church statement.
It has been an age-old debate among theologians about the 3 attributes of God that Christians are supposed to accept, that God is all loving, God is all powerful, and God is all knowing. And they argue a lot about how those 3 things can possibly sit together, given the state of the world. So David Hume is picking up on that argument with his philosophy here.
But can I just pick up on something that Margaret pointed out? While we might accept random happenstance, when dreadful things happen to us, we are fortunate that we do have a faith, because it's our faith that sees us through the crisis. We go to God in prayer and we say, God, please don't abandon me. Please help me get through this crisis. And having faith that God is listening is actually what carries us through that particular crisis. So retaining the faith is very important. And I personally often wonder how non-believers manage to get through their crises.
But I also think, Ian, that many people end up feeling terrible because they can't find God in the happenstance, and they can't find and get any comfort from their faith when something really dreadful happens to them. If they were a victim of that circumstance you're talking about, we end up back in the Job situation. Where is God? How do I hang on to my faith in this situation?
And that's where we're going to go on from now, because that's where Job is. And we're going to be looking at the Lament of Job in chapter 23, which is the lectionary reading. that we're considering. So, but first, we're going to have a look at the structures and questions of the book of Job, and we're going to watch 4.5 minutes of the Bible Project. Now, this is the other video. I showed you part of Job number 1 in the wisdom literature last week. This is their other big video on Job, and you've got the URL if you want to watch all of it in your notes.
Book of Job is a profound and very unique book in the Bible for lots of reasons. The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main character, Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any clear period of ancient history. This all seems intentional, though. It's like the author doesn't want us to be distracted by historical questions, but rather to focus simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue. And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man, and then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because you bless him with prosperity. Let Job suffer. Then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting up the real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with a suffering and bewildered Job who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by 3 friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering and the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how this section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend. Then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on back and forth for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now, Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent. And so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now, we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand, they beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just, the implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way, and so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God.
Job does do that. And we're going to now consider the questions that the Bible Project has raised in their little video about Job. Is God just? Does God run the universe on strict principles of justice? And how is Job's suffering to be explained? How would you answer these questions? To have a look at these questions. So does God run the universe on strict principles of justice? Is he just? How is Job's suffering to be explained? And how would you answer these questions? How did you go with thinking about these questions? Is God just? Is the universe run on strict principles of justice? And how do you explain Job's suffering? No. Is that a no from you, Piers?
Yes.
You want to
It's a
elaborate
very
on that?
definitely no. I think he set the universe up, and then up to a point, he left us to run it. But trying to express, particularly through the message from Jesus, that we are the responsible people who've got to care for other people and the world in general.
That's the old clockmaker theory, isn't it, Derek?
Well, I don't think it's a clockmaker theory at all, but never mind. What about?
It's similar that you set the universe up and it just runs.
Well, yes, all right.
Isn't there a difference between setting the universe up and running it and setting the universe up and being a guide?
Probably. You could run it like someone who's interested in all the minute details, or you could set it up and let it run by itself, or you could set it up and kind of guide the progress that it's making and do running repairs, I suppose. Along the way.
I like the running repairs.
But that doesn't fit up with the theory of natural selection, does it?
No.
We believe in natural selection and that the dinosaurs came and went because they were superseded by more agile creatures, in this case, the mammals. I don't see how it's guided by God. It's guided by natural selection.
But my question is, what is the interpretation of justice?
I'm glad you asked that question, Mary, because now we're going to segue to the next section, number 3, justice in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
What a good question. And that's exactly where we're going, having a look at justice. And I've given you a couple of definitions there. Tzedakah is the Hebrew word and dikaiosune is the Greek word, and they can mean righteousness or justice. They're both equally valid interpretations. Righteousness tends to be the more common translation, and in about half the cases where we find just and justice in the King James Version, modern versions have changed it to righteous and righteousness. So you can think about that for yourselves. In the biblical world, it's important to remember that the idea of justice and righteousness are intertwined and are part of the same concept. So, justice. It primarily has to do with conduct in relation to others, especially with regard to the rights of others. And it is applied to business, where just weights and measures are demanded. It's applied to courts, where the rights of the rich and poor, Israelite and sojourner, are equally regarded. And it applies justice and only justice shall you pursue, says Deuteronomy. And impartiality and fairness in the courts is close to the heart of God, who expects that you shall not follow a majority in wrongdoing or subvert the cause of those in the right. In a larger, more global sense, justice isn't just about giving others their rights, but involves the active duty of establishing those rights. So Israel waits upon God's justice. Israel seeks God's justice, which means to rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, and plead for the widow. In Isaiah, we find it's to decide with equity for the meek of the earth and to maintain the right of the lowly and destitute. So you can see that close to the heart of God is the poor and oppressed of the world, according to the prophets and the Psalms. So God's justice or righteousness is founded in the very nature of a God, according to most of the Hebrew Bible, and is expressed in the way God relates to the world. And you get different kinds of justice. You get retributive justice, and that appears in the prophets mainly, And God appears to be never indifferent to good or evil. And the prophets all insist upon God's demand for justice or righteousness when they're talking to the people. So I bear my righteousness or justice, and my salvation shall not tarry. However, you will notice when you read this that this justice is contingent upon how people are relating to one another. But that's not the only aspect of God's justice. Just as with humanity, justice to God means the relief of the oppressed and needy. So justice and mercy will go together. God is a just God and Saviour, says Isaiah. I bring near my righteousness or justice, and my salvation shall not tarry, says Isaiah in 3 of the Psalms. And the righteous acts of God also mean God's deeds of deliverance, such as the Exodus. So Israel sings of the justice or judgments of the righteousness of God. Remember, they're the same, this word. And proclaims her trust in these. And there's an awful lot of mention in the Hebrew scriptures to those things. So God's justice is always about relationship. It's about relationship with people, with other people, and it's about God's covenant relationship with Israel. Any questions about that?
Is there any justice in the people at the end of their exodus when they came to Israel, that they went into a country which they claim was promised to them by God, but they were destroying previous civilizations and no doubt killing a lot of people in the process of taking over the land? There doesn't seem to be justice at all to me.
No, it's not justice from the way we think about it. You're quite right, Piers. And I'm not saying that I think this concept that I'm defining is the absolute right thing that everybody does. I'm just telling you basically what the texts say about what God's justice is. And it's about God's relationship mainly with the people of Israel. So other people who are not Israelites, depending on the book you're reading, can be treated quite differently. And just to mention, in returns to the so-called conquest of Israel, it probably didn't happen historically. There's no evidence for it. What all the evidence seems to point to, that the Israelites were in the area anyway, and they rose to prominence among a number of, ethnic groupings in that area. And by assimilation and probably a few battles over towns, managed to float to the top and become the dominant ethnic grouping in the land of Canaan, and then invented a big battle story for themselves where they all valiantly took it over. But that's a by the by, just for your information, Piers.
No, I agree with that. The archaeological evidence is not, doesn't agree with the story.
With the text. No, it doesn't. It doesn't at all.
Elizabeth, can I just go back to an earlier part of the study? Is it significant that Job of the land of Uz is not an Israelite, nor are his three companions who are from wherever else? So they're not children of Israel.
No.
They are not the chosen people. They're complete outsiders in terms of Judaism.
As far as Judaism is concerned, current Judaism, if you're talking about that, they've got no issue with that. And they claim Job as one of their own and the people in there as followers of God. There isn't a problem that way. And if you look at my notes from week 1 on Job, you'll see that I say that it's been set here. All scholars think it's been set outside of Israel with non-Israelites. Simply so, all of these big questions can be explored without anyone being accused of blasphemy or about not respecting God, etc., etc. So it's set in the way it is. So it's got a lot more freedom than if it was 3 Israelites or 4 Israelites or whatever. So that is why it's set where it's set. But it's the God of Israel, and this God clearly has a relationship with Job and his friends and has dominion over them, to use that ancient term.
And maybe it also picks up the idea that Solomon, who is the great example of wisdom, was most powerful Israelite king, and Solomon and the Queen of Sheba and kings from all the nations came to him. So Israelite sense of wanting to put themselves on the world stage, they did that in terms of telling the story of Solomon, but they're also doing it here in terms of philosophizing about God and justice and suffering and so on by having the Israelite commitment to righteousness and justice engaged with people from around the world, like philosophers from other nations, so to speak. Could there be an element of that?
No,
Why not?
because no scholar ever says that.
Well, I've just said it.
You're not a Job scholar. You don't count.
Well, there might be new ideas to be thought about then.
There you are. Write a paper on it, John. Take your new idea and prove it.
It's only an idea
No.
that came to me today, so, you know.
Everyone I've read thinks it's
Yep.
set here so these big issues can be discussed without any accusation of.
Oh, yeah,
blasphemy.
yeah, I think so, yeah. But it also shows that Israel, it's what the later apologists were doing, you know, what Philo and Josephus are doing, that Israel can take their place in the discussion of ideas in the world.
I think that Philo
One of the
would.
things that we tend to forget is that Job was written as a sort of a play.
Yes, it's a
You know,
fable.
it's
That's right.
not written as history.
No.
Because after all,
That's right, yeah.
we don't know that much of what God and the accuser do up in heaven. So the thing is set up anyway, and it's discussing the way that people thought in those days. as much as
Well,
anything.
it's just discussing the way one person thought. This is the Philo of the exile, I reckon. If
Yeah.
you know Philo and he's writing, he's a Jew and he's a very urbane, sophisticated, Hellenized Jew. And he writes like no other Jew on the face of the earth. And I think Job is his ancient equivalent. And the author of Job is writing like no other Jew at this time. And we'll see why he's so subversive, but not in the way that we see Jesus as subversive. It's a
Could it be
different
also
kind.
a story which is common amongst other cultures in the area?
It does draw on ancient Near Eastern stuff. If you have a look at, now, what was it I was looking at with that? Norman Harbour's commentary on Job is probably the best one, if you can get hold of a copy of that, to look on that. And it goes through looking at that. And if you look at the introduction to Job I sent you from the NRSV, you'll see that it draws parallel lines with other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So there are elements of this storytelling that it is drawing from those other cultures. But some of its references would indicate that it's either exilic or post-exilic. It may have earlier stuff in it, but most people would date it late for those reasons. Because it's drawing on a lot of the Psalms, it's drawing on the wisdom literature. It's drawing on things like, it makes references to Ecclesiastes, it makes references to the book of Proverbs. So it's probably quite late and has a lot of things at its disposal. But yes, it is drawing on other things from the area. But it's quite unique in the Hebrew Bible, as we will see. So far the story is running on several assumptions. Job's starting point that he's innocent, so we've established that. And we know that because we've seen what happened in the heavenly court. And that implies his suffering is not caused by divine justice. That is, he's not being punished. This has two concluding implications. The first is God doesn't run the world according to human principles of justice, or the second is God is unjust. So that's what this book is going to go on and explore. And the Friends, of course, are taking a different standpoint. They're there starting from the traditional Israelite positions, even though they're not Israelites, that God is just, which implies that God runs the world according to justice. So they have to conclude from their thinking that Job has committed a bad sin or sins. So in the light of this, how are we expected to understand God's justice in these chapters on Job? And we're just going to briefly discuss that in the big group. How do you understand God's justice in these chapters of Job? Do you have an opinion?
In the end, God says, look, Job, you don't know what you're talking about. I'm the guy who created you and created the whole earth, and you've got no idea what you're talking about. You've got no idea what my justice is like. You've got no idea what I'm like.
That's pretty much what the spoiler conclusion is, Derek. You're right. Ian, what were you going to add to that?
I was just saying my faith in God's justice was restored by chapter 42, where Job is rewarded for his endurance and
is he rewarded, Ian?
Patience, but for for not giving way, cursing God and dying. He gets it all back in the end. So I could finish the book and be satisfied that at least in the book of Job, justice did prevail.
Justice, I would argue, does not prevail in the book of Job. And I'd challenge you and say, where does it say it's a reward?
Well,
Don't answer that question,
rewards
Ian.
him by multiplying his herds.
No, that's not what I said, Ian.
Sorry.
I want you to go back and read it
Well, perhaps I
and
should
tell
read
me
it
if it
again.
says it's a
What-
reward.
The one thing God couldn't do was bring back the 10 children that had been killed.
Yep, I get that. But as I said, go back and reread it and then come back and tell me if you really think it was a reward.
Just justice.
And even if it was justice, it's an interesting ending. It's a very curious ending in some ways. Anyone else other than Ian or Derek that would like to contribute to this and has something they want to say about understanding God's justice?
Are we confusing justice and just? God is just, but our outlook on justice is, you know, I come out of a court and I want the judge was wrong. He made the wrong decision. We want justice. It happens all the time in our law courts.
It does.
And justice is one thing, but for God to be just is another thing.
Well, one's a verb and one's a noun, basically. It's a grammatical thing. If you are just, you do justice.
Yes, but I think we've got two ideas of justice.
We
With
probably
justice
do.
And, justice and righteous. We don't normally
Yeah.
think of justice and righteousness as being together.
Well, they are together in this, and I'm telling you,
yeah.
in the Hebrew Bible, you can't, you shouldn't separate them, and in the New Testament, you shouldn't separate them either. Dikaiosune, it means just
the world
and
today
righteous.
does separate them. But
Well,
I
the
think that's probably-
translators
probably
separate.
Our thinking
Derek,
is
shush.
slightly tainted with the way that we've been brought up to think what justice is.
I'm telling you that the translators separate them.
But the translators do that because of what Derek's saying, which is
Yeah.
that there's a common and widespread sense that justice and righteousness are understood differently.
Yeah, but
that's
what
why
I'm
they're doing it.
asking people to do is to suspend that and actually think of them in the Bible as they're not separated. They're the same thing.
You see, in the NIV, Isaiah 46:10 is a righteous God and a Savior, not a just God.
Yeah, but you can translate it, Derek, as a just God. That's my point.
Yes,
That's
yes, but it's-
equally valid.
Yeah, I know.
But the translator makes the choice. So wherever you see righteous, you need to think just. And when you see just, you need to think righteous. And translators choose one or the other. A more accurate translation would be to say God is just and righteous. That would bring it into our language much more accurately. And we don't do that. Translators choose. You'll find that that word dikaiosune in the letters of Paul is not 90% of the time will be translated as just or justice. If you look at the book of Matthew, you'll find it's about 50-50 in the Gospel of Matthew. And it's just arbitrary in many ways how people translate it. The context doesn't always tell you, which it should be. If you read the story of the sheep and the goats in chapter 25 of Matthew, if you read it as, and the just shall enter into heaven, and the just shall stand at my right-hand side, it reads very differently. And you can translate it that way. That's not a poor translation. So I'm suggesting if you said, if the just and the righteous stand on my right-hand side, you'd have a much more accurate depiction of that word dikaiosune, and zedekah is the same in Hebrew. But we tend to use just in the prophets far more than we use righteous. And again, that's a translation thing. So I'm wanting you to actually think about not how you're conditioned to see those words, because you're right, they are different, but how the Hebrew people heard that word. And that's what we need to do when we're exploring this sense of justice/righteousness as we go through Job. So we're coming now to the lectionary reading, which is Job 23, which I hope a number of you have been able to look at. And this lament of Job reveals his anger, loneliness, and frustration. And as Margaret was saying earlier, Job has reached a point here where he cannot find God, and the text tells you that. God is very distant to him. No matter where Job looks, God isn't there. His grievance and his suffering actually spurs him to call out to God to demand a day in court when he can put his case about what is happening to him and how unfair it is. Job is convinced he'll be vindicated in such a court because of the way he understands justice, and his well-intentioned friends have failed to satisfy him with their orthodox answers, indeed have failed even to listen to him. So even if he is being rebellious, Job decides he needs to take a risk and deal with God directly. And therefore he's increasingly insistent, and he's increasingly frustrated, and he's increasingly, really ramping up the temperature of things when God refuses to answer. In an article by Carl Jacobson on Working Preacher, it points out Job is clearly ready for the day in court. But therein lies the problem. Job can't find his way to the courthouse, and God is nowhere to be found. God's hand, it seems to Job, neither leads him or holds him fast. So here we have someone who's completely bereft. And we've got this play on the word way again. Way is mentioned something like 17 plus times in the book of Job. And it is a thread or theme that runs through it. And I mentioned last week that there's a lot of irony about this, that God knows the way to Job, and Job keeps God's way, but Job is unable to find his way to get to where God is. So there's a lot of irony around this word. So in the next few chapters, we have the last speech of Job after his friends are talking, and he will recount all of his good deeds. He will strenuously deny he's got any hidden sins, and he names a whole lot of sins that could be hidden that he doesn't done. He will lament that those that used to look up to him now mock him for the calamity that has fallen on him. So we've got shades of Psalm 22 here, which was on the lectionary last week, where it says, and that's the psalm that is used extensively in the Passion narrative in the Gospels, the Synoptics and the Gospel of John. And here we have Job in that same position. People are mocking him now for the calamity that's come upon him. So Job has discovered that there is no charge against himself. And probably there's an awful lot of criminals that have us believe that there's no charge against them at all. And he's challenging God to find one against him. Job is so confident of his innocence that he would be very pleased to see any godly charge made public, and he is prepared to refute it point by point. There's a lot of irony in these last chapters in Job's speech. Job names God as being his adversary and writing the writ of which he is accused of. And he says, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my signature. That means my writ or my document. Let the Almighty answer me. Oh, that I had the indictment written by my adversary. And again, there's a lot of irony around this because we know what the indictment was, and it wasn't really an indictment at all. It was a wager. And as readers, we know that Job's adversary was, in fact, the Hasatan, who has neither defended Job or been his advocate. Now, advocate is a number of themes, again, that runs through the book of Job, and it occurs in 3 chapters in a substantial way, apart from the first 2, where it's clearly the Hasatan. And Job states the belief that there is a heavenly court and someone in that court will rise up and plead his case, who will redeem him. And the Hebrew word here, you'll meet it again in Ruth, it's goel, and it's translated as redeemer. This advocate has been identified with the figure of the Hasatan, whom we know started the whole mess in the first place. And so there's a bunch of scholars that think that you can argue, and I've quoted one of them here, Michael Oblath, and I've given, look him up. This is his whole quote, it can indeed be argued that the narrative points strongly in the direction of identifying the advocate as a participant in the heavenly court, not God, but one of the Ben Elohim, the divine beings or the sons of God, who had presented themselves before God in 1:1:6 and 2:1. This advocate, says Job, will speak the truth of the events which occurred, will serve as a witness, for he knows the events. He will protect Job, for he has the courage and function to be prosecutorial before God. The only candidate that actually fits that role we know of in the story is actually the Satan. So because the Ha-Satan, or the adversary, is the only visible witness to God's action and how Job lives, he's the one roaming the earth, and he's the one who has discussed with God what's going to happen to Job. He's therefore the only one able in the heavenly court to argue Job's case before God. This is one of the wonderful ironies of the book of Job, that the person or the being that got Job into this great mess is the one that Job is confident will speak for him and deliver him from it. So, how does this plot twist strike you? And we'll just talk about that briefly in the big group. How do you find this interesting turn of events here?
For us, it's rather difficult to separate the Ha-Satan of Job, the adversary, from the evil one that we learn about as Christians. So I wish they'd just refer to him as the adversary.
Yeah, and it'd make it easier. I agree, Ian. And I think, again, translators have done us a mighty disservice here.
But going back to the question, I was quite astounded when I read that about, you know, the one, there's only one person who really knows what's going on, and that's the advocate, the Satan. And I thought, wow, that is quite a twist in the story.
Indeed.
And I don't know quite how to explain it, but I was quite taken aback with that. That is a very clever plot.
Yes, the author of Job has a brain the size of the planet, I reckon, Margaret.
That's amazing to do that.
It's a very clever thing, and we don't have time to discuss the way is used in this ironic sense. It's too intricate and complex, but there's all these things that run through Job, and the way the author riffs off things like Psalm 8 and Psalm 22 and Proverbs 8, as we'll see shortly, and how he turns these things that are taken for granted, or we have certainly taken for granted, upside down, and he really just questions them.
So as a piece of literature, if you're looking at it as a piece of literature, it's remarkable, and I've never noticed this before until reading your notes, this play on words, the ironies, the twist, that final twist in the plot. Now, I don't have any answers for it, but I'm stunned by the literary merit of it.
Yes. Whoever constructed this was brilliant. And if you look at it in the Hebrew, it's of course full of all sorts of Hebrew literary devices like complex chiasms and parallelisms, and that just enhance that literary brilliance. But yes, there's lots of irony. There's a lot of dark humour in here. There's lots of word plays and things that, of course, don't come into English well. It's a brilliantly constructed piece of work.
And I think this is one of the things we lose when we look at the Bible as the so-called Word of God. We sometimes, very often lose the literary merit of individual parts of it. And wow, I'm glad I've suddenly seen this. Thank you.
This is why I love Job, because it's not so much I subscribe to the theology of Job, but it's so clever.
Oh,
it's a remarkably clever book. The other reason I love Job is the ecosystem kind of thing that's presented in the whirlwind speeches, but we'll get to that next week. Anyone else want to make a comment on that, about this plot twist? Did anyone see this coming?
The irony to me, if you think of it in a modern context, it's something like the prosecutor in a capital murder case, changing tack and pleading for the accused to the judge.
Yeah, that's
becoming
right.
a defender almost at the in the same breath, twisting.
I mean, no one's suggesting in the book that the Ha-Satan is going to do anything of the sort. It's just ironic that Job is calling on this very person that got him into the mess in the first place.
Yeah.
Another query, Elizabeth. In the English, at least in the New Revised Version, it comes across as quite elegant poetry, the whole book. Is that what it is in the Hebrew? Is it a sublime poem in the original Hebrew?
Yes, it's more sublime than it is in English because you've got all the word plays in Hebrew, which you don't get into. It doesn't come into English, into translation. So yes, it's nearly all poetry. There's narrative bits, like the beginning and end are narrative, but the whirlwind speeches and the speeches of Job and his friends are all Hebrew poetry. Well, if there's no other questions about the plot twist, we're going to move to chapter 28, which is one you might be wondering why Job is considered wisdom literature, and this might answer your question. Where can wisdom be found in the book of Job?
Yeah, so verse 12 actually asks that question in the middle of what my Bible calls this interlude. There is this question in verse 12, but where shall wisdom be found and where is the place of understanding? That's what we prayed in our prayer. So in thinking about wisdom, we saw in Proverbs that wisdom is described in terms of gems. Her income is better than silver. Her revenue is better than gold. She, wisdom, is far more precious than jewels. Nothing you desire can compare with her. So that's one of the early poems in Proverbs, and there are others in chapter 8 and furthermore about Proverbs. Compare that with the way this interlude on wisdom in Job starts. Job picks up on the idea of silver and gold and jewels and the work that needs to be done deep down in the earth to mine, to search for them, to mine for them. Surely there is a mine for silver and a place for gold to be refined. Iron is taken out of the earth and copper is smelted from ore. So, I mean, it seems that what's happening here in Job 28 is like we've seen earlier, and we noticed last week, when there's a kind of a riffing off and a turning around of the Psalm 8, about the wonders of the universe and the place of human beings in it. We saw last week how Job turns that around. Well, here he's doing the same kind of thing with Proverbs, with the precious gem imagery relating to wisdom. Miners put an end to darkness and search out to the farthest bounds, the ore in gloom and darkness. They open shafts, they're forgotten by travellers, they get suspended remote from people. So on it goes, a whole detailed description of mining, which of course is hard work and is searching in the darkness for something that may or may not be found. So it's an interesting and useful analogy for searching for wisdom. But what Job says is that whereas miners might well discover some precious metals, some precious gems in their searching, in their mining, where shall wisdom be found? Mortals do not know the way to it. It is not found in the land of the living. It is so hard to find that we human beings cannot find wisdom. Only God knows the way to wisdom. And that's in direct contrast to what wisdom herself has said, that she has said that she's not hard to find, and she is out there in the public arena, in the streets, at the corners, at the gates of the city. And she invites everyone to sit at her table. So in the last part of this, actually just before we do that, in the last part of chapter 28, there is the verse that says that God actually knows the way to wisdom. God finds it. God, in verse 27, he saw it and he declared it. He established it and he searched it out. And Norman Harble, in the commentary that Elizabeth gave me this morning to read about Job, has a really good analysis of this, because he's saying the verbs in Hebrew that we don't quite get in English, the verbs in Hebrew that are used here, he saw it, he declared it, he established it, he searched it out, are precisely the verbs that are used. Like if you go to a jeweler's shop and you present a piece of jewelry, then the jeweler sees it and observes it and investigates it and searches it out and makes an assessment of it. That's precisely what God is doing in relation to wisdom, says Norman Harble. So the stock standard thing in Proverbs is that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And lo and behold, we find right at the very last verse in chapter 28 that this is said, truly the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And then in typical Hebraic poetry style, giving a kind of a parallel to it, a different parallel, to depart from evil is understanding. The fear of the Lord is wisdom, to depart from evil is understanding. Now, as is said in the notes, some scholars believe that this is not actually the character Job's voice, but this is a narrator trying to tie up the stuff here by drawing on this traditional saying. And in fact, this is the first time that the word, the Lord, the name of God, the Lord, is used in Job. It's the first time that it's used in Job's speeches and it's with each of his friends. So in other words, give up looking for God's justice and search for God's wisdom. In other words, Job is not going to answer the question that we've been grappling with for a lot of today. Is God just? Why isn't God intervening? Why do things go wrong, especially if you're good and righteous like Job was? The book won't answer that. Rather, the book is an invitation to say, search for wisdom. Shun evil, which is what Job has done because he is a truly righteous man. Shunning evil hasn't protected him from affliction and hasn't given him any discernment as to why he's been suffering like this. So he needs to seek wisdom. So that's a way of reading the book. Rather than trusting in justice and retribution and reward, we simply say, that's a mystery we can't understand. What we need to do is trust God's wisdom. And so the question now is, how do we feel about this line of interpretation of Job?
Okay, how did you go with that question? So rather than trusting in justice and retribution and reward and the old doctrines, we need to trust in God's wisdom. How do you feel about that statement?
I think we felt it provided an equal answer to the question of justice.
In what way, Bill? Do you want to unpack that?
That we're equally perplexed. Ultimately, it presumes there's an answer.
Yes.
And
Yes.
what we're left with is a mystery that we can't really explain how God acts in the world.
Yeah. And some of us came down to not wanting to go as far as the word wisdom, but just say trust.
Yeah.
Trust. Just leave it at trust and the mystery of God, which is unfathomable.
But all these words, whether it's trust or wisdom or faith or love or justice, doesn't provide an answer to the sort of the unanswerable question.
That's right.
Yeah.
Job's predicament.
Of why there is evil in the world.
Yeah, that's right. And that's the mystery. Because one of the things we were saying is we tend to want to think about God in human terms, the way we think, the way we act, and try to box God into something we can understand. Whereas God, the divine, even if you don't want to use the word God, the divine is mystery. And that's what Job's about, I reckon.
And I think so. When we come next week to the whirlwind, that's probably pretty much on the money, I think.
But Elspeth, on the journey so far, I really struggle to separate God from Steve Jobs, who owns iPhones. I relate very well with the guy. I buy iPhone and stay in his community, but he's mighty, all understanding, all knowledge, and all powerful, all money, but he couldn't give a shit about my welfare.
He probably does care, I think. That's probably going a bit too far to say he doesn't care at all. But it's interesting, the three attributes of God we often attach to, Christians often attach to God, which is all loving, all knowing, and all powerful, actually don't apply in Job. He's not all knowing because he's relying on the Ben Elohim and the Hasatan to tell him what's going on in the earth. He knows some things, but he doesn't know everything. He's all seeing, but we don't consider that in Christian tradition. He is all powerful. He can wave his hands and say to the Satan, yeah, go test him or do this or do that. And he makes that clear in the whirlwind. So that bit's true. Is he all loving? That's debatable, I think, in this book.
Yeah.
God's way of operating is quite different in Job, as the whirlwind speeches will make clear when we get to them next week. Is there any other comments on this question about justice, reward, retribution, and wisdom?
I just that it's a marvellous exercise in rhetoric.
It certainly is. There's many, many rhetorical features here that are quite brilliant. Coming to the conclusion of today, we've got an impasse going on here at the moment, because until God shows up in the whirlwind, nothing's happening. Job has scorned the counsel of his friends. He thinks they see blindly and hear deafly. And they, on the other hand, can't understand their stubbornness, his stubbornness. So they're at this point where no one's going to move forward. They don't recognise that Job and his suffering is the one who's getting closer to an understanding of God, as distasteful as that understanding might be. And though God might crush him, Job still defiantly declares his trust. There is a great sense of Job's longing for God's presence and attention of caring in these speeches. And I would suggest that for today, for us to think about, that is a feeling we can all resonate with. As many of us, we may have experienced such feelings in tragic and other circumstances that occur throughout our lives. Many of us will have sought comfort in such times through prayer. And even today, in uncertain times, we've got climate change and pandemics and wars and natural disasters happening. We still seek the presence of God in the midst of this suffering and injustice. Suffering is always going to challenge us, and it's always going to challenge our sense of relationship with God, but it does not have to destroy that relationship. And as Christians, we believe in the midst of suffering, God can be found and does come to the afflicted and affirms that presence of grace. Spill the Beans, which is an electronic liturgical kind of thing I subscribe to, and is very useful for using for prayers and other getting ideas about what you might do in your service or your sermon. This week saw Job's anger as similar to the author of Psalm 44, who demanded that God wake up, stop sleeping, stop hiding his face. And you can see it up here. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake. Do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppress? So these ideas in Job are not unknown in Israelite writings and scriptures. So this psalm raises important questions about what is and what is not okay to say to God in prayer, as indeed the book of Job does, because Job does a lot of demanding towards God about what he expects God to do. And it raises for us questions such as, are we honest with God about how we feel? Do we allow ourselves to actually lament when there's tragedy to God about the unfairness of these tragedies that we encounter in life? Do we shout at God and say, how could you do this to me? Which is pretty much what Job's doing and the psalmist is doing. And Spill the Beans suggests that it's important that such questions be voiced before God. And they like the honesty in Job's story that challenges the superficial kind of faith that crumbles when the first sign of tragedy strikes. And they like the fact it gives us freedom and permission to say what we need to say to God, even if, like Job, we end up having to apologise later. God can take it, and surely God's grace and love will be there waiting for us. So part of the power of the book of Job up to this point is that it realistically addresses the painful questions of life. Tragedy and suffering are not simple issues. They've not got simple answers. They can challenge our faith and do. They can create senses of helplessness and hopelessness. And like Job, we might find there's no shortage of opinions from others trying to explain to us the pain we are suffering is something we're being tested for, or we've brought on ourselves, or we're not really suffering, and offer simplistic answers in response to life's most painful questions. So in a sense, that's a gift that this book is giving to us for all its darkness, for its clever, for all of its clever irony and rhetoric and poetry. It's offering us something that is a gift. It gives us permission to be able to lament, to be able to say these things, to be able to actually be ourselves and to be as honest as we can as we come before God in times when we feel we're really being tested. So that's where we're leaving Job this week. Does anyone have any final questions that they want to ask?
That last slide you put up,
They are
Psalm
nice, aren't
44,
they?
you should have gone on to Psalm 46. Be still and know that I am God.
Well, we're not up to that bit yet. Next week, we're up to that bit, Derek, Psalm 46, because that's pretty much what God says to Job, be still and know I'm God, though probably a little bit more bluntly than that. We're still sitting here at Psalm 44 at the moment because that's exactly where we're leaving Job, at the end of his speeches and before we encounter God. So next week, we'll be looking at what's called the whirlwind speeches. That's when God shows up, finally. After all of God, Job saying, where are you? Come on, I want my day. God shows up and God has quite a lot to say. He speaks for quite a number of chapters. And then there's the last epilogue, as it's known at, where there's restoration is made to Job for some of what he has lost. And even that has certain irony in it. And it's very hard to pick it up in English. But if you do read ahead, I would challenge you to look at the restoration and look at what God says to the friends and to Job and work out for yourself, or see if you can work out for yourself what's really going on here. There's also a great mistranslation right at the end of the speeches of Job. It's a huge one. It's to do with sackcloth and ashes. And I'll challenge you using Google, and maybe a good study Bible might tell you what the proper translation is. What is Job doing when he says he talks of sackcloth and ashes? So there's some things for you to think about and to try and discover as an answer to part of the puzzle this week. And I can tell you now, your Bibles are wrong in that verse. So your challenge is to find out what is wrong. How should it be translated?
What verse is it, please?
That's a good question. Fair and to the point.
42:6.
42:6.
Thank
Is
you.
it?
42:6.
Thank you, John, because I don't have my Bible open in front of me. Job says something about sackcloth and ashes.
Yeah, don't give it away.
I'm not. I'm just saying, what is it he actually says? Because what you've got in front of you is not right. Anyway, you don't have to answer that now. You've got all week to think about it. So that'll be our last session on Job, part 3. We'll send out a study guide as usual. And because I'm preparing it, it's late. It's not getting to you as timely as I would like it, but I will do my best to have something out to you in a more timely fashion next week.